This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
The road in is the road out. So we've got to know what actually created the dysfunction so we can correct that. A lot of women are frightened of their appetite. Most people think they have to lose weight to be healthy, when my experience is the opposite. You've actually got to be healthy to lose weight. We pursue the approval of others still as adults. It's as if we still believe that it's essential for our survival. The world would fall apart if women stopped caring. We would lose the magnificent sense of community that caring and kindness creates.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? Welcome to the Season 2 Expert Series, where you'll meet 24 of the world's leaders in health discussing their passions and what it takes to make a shift.
We tend to be our harshest critics.
We are more than the muscle and bones in our body.
Whoa, that's so opposite of what I was taught growing up.
I would like a call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine and this is The Shift. Hi, I'm Katherine, naturopath, author and host of The Shift. In the Expert Series, we share the insights, stories and expertise of each of our amazing experts. We're talking doctors, authors, naturopaths, researchers and thought leaders. You may have heard them on Season 2 of The Shift, where we took snippets of these interviews to put them together in the series for you. If you haven't listened to Season 2 yet, I'd highly recommend checking out Episode 1, which will give you an overview of what constitutes women's hormonal health and a sneak peek into the series. We'll provide a link in the show notes. In this episode of The Shift, we have Dr. Libby Weaver. Dr. Libby is a nutritional biochemist with a PhD and a 13 times best-selling author. She is a respected international speaker, having shared the stage with the likes of Tony Robbins, Sir Richard Branson and Marianne Williams, to name a few. Armed with an abundance of knowledge, scientific research and a true desire to help people regain their energy and vitality, Dr. Libby empowers and inspires people to take charge of their health and happiness through her books, live events and online courses. She's regularly called upon by the media as an authoritative figure in the health and wellness space. When it comes to achieving and maintaining ultimate health and wellbeing, Hollywood stars Hugh Jackman and Deborra-lee Furness describe her as a one-stop shop in achieving and maintaining ultimate health and wellbeing. I can't wait to share this conversation with you. It was definitely one of my favourites and I know you'll love Dr. Libby too. Let's jump in. Dr. Libby Weaver, thank you so much for joining me on The Shift. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. But before we get started, can you please tell everyone, who is Libby Weaver and what's the story that's led you to where you are today?
So I grew up in Tamworth in country New South Wales in Australia with chickens in the backyard and growing some vegetables. And that was a really wonderful way to grow up and has influenced my adulthood. I have my own chickens now and my own vegetable patches. I went to university for 14 years, which I know makes me sound really thick and like I probably failed everything, but I very much loved learning and I still do. So I originally studied nutrition and dietetics with honours and then did a PhD. And then I went out and worked with people, which I've done now for just over 20 years in clinical practice. And I really found that was where the rubber really hit the road. That was where you got to see what really obviously made a difference in people's lives and also what didn't. So I combined my 14 years at uni with my 20 plus years of clinical practice to create what I've called my 3-pillar approach. And those 3 pillars are the biochemical, the nutritional and the emotional. So I look at absolutely everything through those 3 lenses and find it incredibly rewarding to do so with people.
So 14 years at university, I think that's incredibly impressive and shows your curiosity and your thirst for knowledge, absolutely. I'm curious, what was your PhD in?
I worked with children with autism, so I looked at biochemical, immunological, microbiological and nutritional factors in the children. So I received blood, urine and faeces samples from the children and compared them to other children in the family who didn't have autism. And then I was changing their diets and what they were eating and then looking at changes in the blood, urine and faeces. So it was incredibly rewarding and I learnt, I think, more about the human body in the years of my PhD than I could ever have imagined. I also learnt a huge amount about human behaviour and really also started to see the impact that true, genuine stress could have on people's lives. So it was a very rewarding experience, but incredibly deep learning.
Oh, amazing. And what did you discover?
So there were significant changes in the children's fecal bacteria profile. So back then we didn't call it the gut microbiome, because I was doing all of this in the late 90s. And back then autism was thought to be a purely neurological condition. But because I was working in clinical practice and seeing children with autism, so often they'd turn up with severe gut symptoms. So I was just trying to help give them a better quality of life by improving gut symptoms. And when I was doing the testing and looking at back then we called it a gut bacteria profile, the trend was that they had very little or no E. coli, which is supposed to be about 90% of the aerobic flora in the gut. And that had been overtaken by Streptococcus species. So quite often the kids of the aerobic flora in the gut, 100% of it would be Streptococcus. And then with dietary change, that would start to come down and digestive system symptoms would start to enormously improve. And interestingly, there was a decreased recurrence rate of things like ear infections, tonsillitis, respiratory-based infections as well came with that decreased strep load in the gut. So it was mind-blowing for me.
Absolutely amazing. So one of the things that we talk about on the shift is this concept of synergy. And this is exactly what you're explaining here. One thing affecting another, not taking a silo approach and going, well, okay, autism is a brain condition, right? Can you tell me what is your interpretation of synergy and how do you look at patients from that holistic standpoint?
Synergy, it's one of my favourite words. Nothing in the body stands alone. Everything has a ripple effect, one thing to something else. So, for example, what I would see very commonly in clinical practice working with women of all ages early on in life, and unfortunately it's starting to happen at younger and younger ages, young girls will start to fiddle with what they're eating, and that usually involves some sort of restriction. And quite often their intake of iron, amongst other nutrients, but particularly iron, starts to go low. Because across the menstruation years, obviously, we need about 18 milligrams of iron per day just to prevent deficiency. And it's very difficult to even eat that much, even when you're, eating satisfying, sustaining meals. So I think the iron intake can start to be suboptimal quite early on in people's lives. And then often stress will start, whether that's challenges with friends or schoolwork or university or in your working life or with money or flatmates or whatever it is, the stress starts. And as the stress starts, that obviously changes our chemistry significantly. It starts to change the HPA axis. It alters progesterone production. It can, in extreme cases, start to disrupt ovulation. So then you don't have enough progesterone, which obviously is a powerful anti-anxiety agent. So then often food choices aren't so great if people have moved out of home initially and they might be living on what I refer to as far too many liver loaders, far too much alcohol and takeaway and highly processed foods, and fat accumulation can start to happen in the liver. That then leads to estrogen dominance. So now they've got too much estrogen, plus they've already got not enough progesterone, and all of this is affecting metabolism. And with the high levels of estrogen, that then starts to mess with thyroid function, plus with the heavy periods that comes with that estrogen dominance, there's more blood loss. So the iron deficiency becomes even worse, and we need iron to make thyroid hormones. So then by the time this whole cascade of events has occurred, often women are in their mid-40s and they'll be diagnosed with a thyroid condition and they don't necessarily understand where it's come from. But that's what I call a synergistic or layering effect as well. So there are so many different things that come together to create what ends up as a thyroid problem, but the thyroid just didn't suddenly wake up one day and go, I'm not going to work properly anymore. It's years and years of suboptimal nutrition, of way too much stress, and I guess putting up with menstrual cycle problems that women don't need to put up with. So there's a bit of a coming together of lots of different factors that then lead to something that we can see or experience, and it requires a synergistic approach then to undo it all.
I love that you're having this timeline conversation, because this is one of the ways that we break down stuff for patients at Shift as well. It's like, okay, well, you have this. This didn't happen overnight. What's the story, right? What's been the progression to actually get you here? So what would you say to people in that same vein who come to see you and they're like, well, I just want this fixed, right?
I think a lot of health professionals probably use this phrase, but it's like peeling back the skin of an onion. So we can identify the pathway, like one I've just described, that very common one that can lead to the thyroid not working properly. But you can imagine, people often link iodine to the thyroid not working properly. But this thyroid problem hasn't been created by an iodine deficiency. And I often use the phrase, the road in is the road out. So we've got to know what actually created the dysfunction so we can correct that. And in this case, with this synergistic layering type effect I've described, quite often we've got to go back and address the poor iron intake or the iron deficiency that might have unfolded. That's often the first step, I find, going back to the beginning of how this all changed. Make sure the person is eating substantial meals. I find there's sort of two ways I think a lot of women in particular eat. They eat like little tiny birds. They just don't eat enough. The meals aren't satisfying or nourishing enough. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, there are some people who, particularly if their emotions are involved, they feel like they start eating and they can't stop and they can eat way too much food. So I think there's a huge amount of confusion out there about how much food is nourishing for us, and it's different for everyone. But the next step after sorting out the iron is to make sure they're eating nourishing meals, because that's going to help to support healthy menstruation and really foster the body feeling safe, in inverted commas, so that HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, is working optimally. And then, of course, there's the stress, but that's a big can of worms to talk about.
Yeah, and we're going to get right into it. I love that the road in is the road out. I haven't heard that before, and I think it just simplifies it. It's like, you got there somehow. You've got to actually undo some stuff here and do some significant healing, right?
Yeah, and on the specifics that created the problem for that person, because I'll use the thyroid again as an example. So obviously the thyroid needs iodine and selenium and zinc and iron. They're the nutrients. And if we're not having enough of those nutrients, the thyroid won't work as efficiently as it could. But then excess amounts of estrogen can also suppress thyroid function. And so no amount of iodine is going to correct a thyroid function that's being troubled by too much estrogen. Sorting out the estrogen dominance will resolve that. So that's why it's incredibly important to work out what's actually driving the challenge for the person.
Let's talk about weight loss, because I know that this is a real home zone for you, and I love the different points of view that you have around this. So can you give me a bit of an overview of what you would consider when it comes to people losing weight, and what does it actually mean, this whole epidemic really of obesity that we're going through?
I've actually never weighed a single patient. I've never had a set of scales in my office. I actually don't mind what someone weighs. When I was still seeing patients, they'd walk through the door and I'd say, how can I help? What would you like to get out of this session? The most common thing I heard was, I want to lose weight. And I would note that down. And then I would set about asking the people my gazillions of questions, everything from, do you get headaches to, do you have any sinus congestion? Do you use your bowels every day? This huge big list of questions. And I would then set about correcting the things that had gone awry with the headaches or the sinus or the gut problems or whatever it was. I'd go and set about correcting that. And then what I found was, if less body fat would actually benefit that person, then that would just be a natural outcome of correcting the sinuses or the gut problems or the recurring headaches or whatever it was that we were addressing. And it's where I guess I really started to see that most people think they have to lose weight to be healthy, when my experience is the opposite. You've actually got to be healthy to lose weight. Otherwise, your body's never going to let go of it. And I had some experiences very early on in my clinical work when I first started to see patients, because I was trained in dietetics, and we were taught that the calorie equation, i.e. how much you eat versus how much you burn, is the only thing that affects body shape and size. And when you get out and start working with people, you learn very quickly that that's not the case. And it was what I was observing in not all, but many, and more, certainly more and more of my patients, led me back to my geeky biochemistry textbooks with the question in my mind, what leads the human body to get the message that it needs to burn fat, and what leads the human body to get the message that it needs to store fat? To date, I've found 9 factors that contribute to whether the body gets the message to use body fat as a fuel or store it. Because in any given moment, the body is always using a combination of fuels, glucose and fat. It's obviously just in different ratios in different moments. So it might be 50-50 glucose to fat, or it could be 80% fat, 20% glucose, or the reverse of that. And our nervous system and our stress response is a huge contributing factor to the ratio of the fuel that we're using. So, for example, adrenaline, one of our stress hormones, because it communicates to the body that our life is in danger, it needs to make sure we have a fast-burning fuel to give us power, to give us fuel to get out of the danger, that the body thinks it's in. So when we have high circulating levels of adrenaline, the body's always going to prefer to use glucose, not body fat, because glucose is the fast-burning fuel. So over the years, I have literally met thousands of people who have almost lost the ability to use body fat effectively as a fuel because their adrenaline levels are just so constantly and relentlessly high. Because obviously historically, and when I say historically, it wasn't that long ago in human history that what led us to make adrenaline was an actual threat to our life. So, someone from another tribe jumping out of the jungle at us with their spear, and in that moment we go, oh, and we're ready to run or fight. So obviously adrenaline drives that fight or flight response. But now in modern times, we're relatively safe, thankfully, and it's far more psychological stress that leads us to produce adrenaline. So and people might want to block their ears when I say this, but it's also caffeine that leads the human body to produce adrenaline. It's our perceptions of pressure and urgency. And I put the word perception there in front of pressure and urgency for a reason, because we get to choose what we perceive as being urgent. And sure, some things are urgent. If you get a phone call from school that your child's been injured, that's urgent. You want to get there as quickly as you can. But what most people have done is they've made what they do each day full of stress and pressure and urgency. And then I think the other big factor that leads us to make adrenaline these days is worrying what other people think of us. And it might not look like that on the surface, but I'm a big fan of really encouraging people to look beneath what looks stressful to them. So, for example, when I would say to someone, what stresses you out, they might say, on my emails or my to-do list or running late. So let's use running late for this example. It's not actually the running late that stresses people out, because when you think about it, what is the problem with that? And when you stop to think, it's actually you're concerned what the person who will be on the receiving end of your running late is going to think of you. If you're running late for a work meeting, you're worried your boss might not think that you care enough or value your job enough. You're worried your boss or your colleagues might think you're lazy or you're inefficient or you're a poor time manager. Or we essentially, so much of our stress comes from perceiving that others are disapproving of us in some way. A common one I've heard over the last 12 months with all the changes people across the world are facing in the way that they work is that their colleague might ring them and say, where's that work? I needed it yesterday. And we don't necessarily hear what someone says. We hear what we think they meant. So when that colleague has said, where's that work? I needed it yesterday. Sure, we've heard their request for the work, but usually what we create in our own mind is that our colleague thinks we're lazy or inefficient or not a hard worker. So in other words, we perceive some kind of disapproval, and that's what makes their request for the work stressful, not the request itself.
So, Libby, it sounds like what you're saying is one of the first steps is really to take self-responsibility and go, okay, what kind of stress am I creating for myself?
100%, Katherine. And what we do, I think, and we all do this, we look at things outside of us and we go, oh, I'm stressed because of that person or that situation or that colleague or that scenario. And what we forget is that it's actually our response to all of those things that determine if that thing is stressful or not to us. Now, I'm not talking about where lives are literally in danger. I'm not talking about those situations. I'm talking about everyday scenarios when we're frustrated by someone or we're concerned we're going to get into trouble from someone, that type of thing. So when we think the stress is coming from outside of us, we feel powerless to change it because we think, well, that's just how they are, or that's just how that situation is. And we then don't take responsibility for it. But I really want to help people to feel empowered, to help people have the tools to actually be able to take responsibility for how they see things, for their perceptions, and also for the way that they think. Because to round back to your earlier question, I really think that stress is having one of the biggest impacts on metabolism and therefore on our body's ability to get the message to utilise body fat efficiently as a fuel.
Gut health is central to everything, so it may be good to get some additional support. Many of my listeners have opted to do my 8-week Heal Your Gut program. In this 8-week course, I'll take you through the strategies that I use with my patients in clinic every day to heal the gut and give you the lifelong tools you need to support your gut health. To join us, go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Programs and Courses. most people, from my observations, are doing this, right? So we're all running around worrying about what other people think of us, like worrying about all this stuff, creating all of this internal stress, right? Why is this happening?
I think we have to change. Things have evolved incredibly quickly recently, and I don't think our physiology, our biochemistry hasn't really been able to keep up with the rate of change. When you think that social media I think it's about 15 years old now, so that's just so new in the evolution of humans, given that we've been on the planet for somewhere between 150 and 300,000 years. It wasn't that long ago that we had to collect our own food. There's just so much that has changed, and it's changed so quickly. And as we've talked about, the pattern of stress hormone production has changed dramatically. So every generation, of course, has had stress, but never before has it been so constant and so relentless, because so much of it now for us is psychological. It's primarily the psychological stress that leads to the stress hormone production for us now, not threats to our life. And so because we've been living in this really intense way for, well, you could argue at least 30 years now, our body can't keep up with that. Our body can't handle that long term. We can do all sorts of things short term, but we can't do it long term. And we certainly don't want it to be multi-generational, because with that constant and relentless output of stress hormones, it's the disruption to the HPA axis, so the hypothalamus, that control region in the brain, telling the pituitary gland, and I call her the mother gland, and she's the mother gland because she speaks to all the other glands in the endocrine system that are making all the other hormones, like the ovaries and the thyroid and the adrenals. So when the hypothalamus asks the question, am I safe, when we've got all of this high circulating adrenaline zooming around in our blood, when it can see that there's all that adrenaline and it says, am I safe? The answer, of course, is no. So the hypothalamus then says to the pituitary, we're not safe. You need to tell your family of organs that we're not safe, and they then respond. So the thyroid produces things based on whether it's safe or not. The adrenals do, the ovaries do, and with the ovaries, that's what can suppress ovulation, which is obviously the main event in the menstrual cycle that leads to that beautiful progesterone production that helps everyone to feel fantastic. It kind of all has to come to a head, and whether that's collectively or in our own individual lives, or obviously our individual lives all contribute to that collective enormous challenge that's sort of bubbling up right now. And we have to start to, I think, learn new tools and start to understand how we think. We have two thought systems inside of us, in our brain. So we have what I just refer to as the old brain, which is on automatic pilot. It's the part of our brain that's been with us in an evolutionary sense for a very long time. It's the part of us that keeps us safe, but it makes decisions in a heartbeat. And then we have what I simply refer to as the new brain, which is a second thought system, which from an evolutionary perspective has become part of us much later down the track. And it has the ability to reason, it can apply logic. But right now, at this point in evolution, it's much slower than our old brain, and it's also optional. So I'll give you an example of this in action and of a way we can start to address how we think. So let's say you're in the supermarket and Mrs. Smith is walking towards you, and you know Mrs. Smith. You don't know her that well, but you know her enough to say hello to. And as you get closer to her, what you perceive is that Mrs. Smith puts her head down and she marches straight past you and she doesn't speak to you. So in that moment, your old brain instantaneously makes a decision about what it means for Mrs. Smith to not have just spoken to you. And all of it's unconscious. So the old brain will usually create some kind of meaning that Mrs. Smith doesn't like us. So if you could hear the dialogue of it, which we can't because it's unconscious and it's really rapid, but if we could hear the dialogue of it, I think it'd be along the lines of, oh my goodness, Mrs. Smith doesn't like me. I've let Mrs. Smith down. I've disappointed her in some way. She thinks I'm a dreadful person. Oh, our kids are at school together. Maybe they had a fight and she thinks I'm the world's worst parent. So some form of Mrs. Smith didn't speak to me because she thinks I'm a dreadful person. So in that moment, when the old brain does that, we're not aware of it. All we know is that when we went to the supermarket, we felt fine, not amazing, not dreadful, just fine. And now when we're heading home, we feel like there's something not right, but we can't identify what that is. We just now know that we can't wait to eat some of the groceries we just bought, or we can't wait to open a bottle of wine and it's way too early in the day for that, or whatever the way people cope with emotional pain is, they will sometimes get fixated on, now I really want that, when before you went to the supermarket, you didn't want that. What we need to remind ourselves of is, in that moment in the supermarket where Mrs. Smith didn't speak to us, is we have the option to bring our new brain in and question what just happened and go, okay, so I haven't seen Mrs. Smith for 3 weeks, so it's very unlikely that I've upset her. But on the off chance that I have, perhaps I could bake her a cake and go around and see Mrs. Smith and check in with her and find out if she's okay. And then on the off chance that I have upset her, we can talk it through. But what we'll probably find is that Mrs. Smith has a lot on her mind, or maybe that day at the supermarket she hadn't had a shower, or she had a big pimple on her face and she was really hoping that she wasn't going to run into anyone. Because what we do endlessly, the way little children do, is we make everything about us. We behave in an incredibly egocentric way quite often as adults, and we're not supposed to. I truly believe that by adulthood, we're supposed to have evolved out of the egocentric ways of our childhood. Children are supposed to be egocentric. And what I mean by that is we think the world revolves around us. We think that if someone's happy, it's because of us. And we think that if they're sad, it's because of us. And unfortunately, we're not given the tools as adults to remember that people behave the way they behave as a reflection of their life experience, as a reflection of their joy, their pain, their beliefs, their values. That's what's on display when you interact or don't interact with someone. I think one of the reasons that so many people are feeling the intensity of stress is because we've got to almost feel the pain of it to go, there has to be another way. There's got to be another way to live. And part of that is examining how I think, seeing the beliefs that I made up as a young person to try to make sense of the environment I was in, about whether I'm enough or not, or whether I'm worthy of being loved, or whatever it is. It's time I examine these beliefs that I absorbed as a child so that I can shift away from needing the approval of others, because while ever we need the approval of others, it's nearly always going to bring stress, because we're not necessarily always going to know what other people are thinking. We're not going to know what they think of us. And not everyone is going to like us, and that's okay.
So when people have been operating from this space for a very long time, obviously it's very ingrained, right? It can be difficult. And what I love about your book and you coming on this podcast is it really is helping just to get those light bulb moments happening for women, right? So I think the first step is they need to own it and go, okay, well, maybe there's some unhealthy thought patterns here, and really examine and be curious about that. But once they see it, how do they work on breaking these habits and these thought patterns?
I call it a truth warrior. So because it's so ingrained, we don't always catch it in action. You know, in the moment in the supermarket when Mrs. Smith walks past us, we're not often aware that that's hurt our feelings. It's later, an hour later, 4 hours later, when we are making some lousy choices. It's when you get a shift in the way that you feel that you want to question it. And you want to be on a mission for the truth, for actuality, not the reality you're perceiving. So it's like a commitment to exercise. It's like a commitment to meditation. Any kind of commitment we make, in a way, requires a discipline. And I think it's the same kind of thing we need to apply to start to change the way that we think. So it can help to have a little notebook in the kitchen where you jot things down, if writing things down helps someone. You can do it in your head. You can just pause and think, okay, when I went to the supermarket, I felt fine. An hour later, I didn't, and bring curiosity to that, not any kind of judgment about yourself, because you might have gone home and polished off a whole packet of biscuits. And instead of the judgment from eating the biscuits, you want to bring curiosity to that. Okay, I wonder what led me to do that. Was I hungry? Was I overdue for my lunch? You know, was it an actual physical need? Okay, I probably need to be a bit better prepared if that was the case, and have some leftovers in the fridge ready to go so I don't demolish all the biscuits. Or was it emotional? Oh, yes, Mrs. Smith didn't speak to me in the supermarket. I can actually see that's hurt my feelings. Yes, I can see that I'm worried what she thinks of me. And that's when you bring that second brain in, that new brain in, to really start to examine that. And it might require courage, because you might need to ring Mrs. Smith up to reassure yourself that she's not upset with you, for example. It's seeing the stories that we make up for each individual, to see the story they've created in that moment about who they must be for Mrs. Smith not to have spoken to them. And it's always some form of disapproval. That's what you're looking for. And it's just a pattern that we pick up as we're growing up as a way that we think that people see us, and that's what we need to undo.
I love it, the part around the non-judgment, and it kind of segues into what I would love to talk a little bit more about is why people know they shouldn't do something but do it anyway, okay? And a good example of this is obviously diet and that kind of thing, but it can be other behaviours like overworking or any of those things. Why does this happen?
I think there are many reasons, but the emotional pillar in my work, I set out early on in my working life to answer the question, why do we do what we do even though we know what we know? Most people know what to eat to feel good, to sleep well, to have a constant even mood, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they do that. I think one of the big contributing factors is what I sort of sum up by saying is not enoughness. So I'll pull that apart a bit. So when we're born, a baby human can't survive on its own. We need someone to take care of us, to meet our needs, to give us food, clothing and shelter, whereas other animals can survive on their own right from the get-go. So as little humans, when we're on the receiving end of the food and the clothing and the shelter, it's sometimes to alleviate discomfort. So we get hungry or we get cold, and then usually an adult comes along and resolves that for us. And then we start to link that to feeling safe, and that then becomes essentially love. So it gets wired into our autonomic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that we can't instruct with our thoughts. It's the part of our nervous system that determines how fast, how quickly our hair grows, how quickly our heart beats. If you cut yourself, you don't have to talk to the cut and tell it to heal up. It just, you come back 3 days later and the cut's all healed up. That's all governed by the autonomic nervous system. So it's wired into our autonomic nervous system when we're tiny little humans that love is essential for our survival. But we know as adults that a life with love in it is delicious, but we can actually survive without it in a physical sense because we can get our own food and clothing and shelter. But for most people, it's still the pursuit of love. I could change love to be approval, really, because I think a lot of people link the word love to romantic love, and I don't mean that. That can be part of it, of course, wanting the love of your intimate partner, but it's not exclusive to that. So really we pursue the approval of others still as adults because it's as if we still believe that it's essential for our survival. And so I think that's partly why when we are on the receiving end of words telling us we're not okay, or when we make up a story that we've let someone down or that someone doesn't like us, it's why it is so stressful to us because we essentially, it's almost like our survival is threatened because it's wired into our nervous system that love and approval is essential for our survival because as little humans, if the adults in our world stopped caring for us, stopped loving us and stopped giving us food and clothing and shelter, we would literally die. So part of, I think, as a species where we need to evolve to is to truly get it ingrained in our nervous systems that the approval of others is not essential for our survival. Because I really believe that when we stack, 5 or 20 or 100 experiences over our day that we won't even be aware of where we've perceived disapproval from others, that's what leads us to make unresourceful choices. It's just become so unconscious that we can't even see it now. And that's why bringing our awareness, bringing our attention to what we're actually doing rather than running on autopilot, rather than letting habits, run us, you can learn so much from those patterns about the beliefs we have about ourselves and then peel it all back to see the truth, which is that you are enough and that you're perfect the way that you are and that you don't actually need the approval of others. It's lovely. Yes, we're human. We all want it, but your life doesn't depend on it. So therefore, we don't have to go away and numb ourselves from the deep, deep fear that we're not enough the way that we are and that the disapproval of others, we don't need to numb that with food or too much alcohol or over-exercise or overwork or whatever it is we do to try to prove our worth.
Oh, I love everything about that. You've written a lot of books, but one of the ones that was the most groundbreaking was Rushing Woman Syndrome. Can you tell me why this was such an important book for you to bring out into the world?
I wrote the book in 2011 and I think it's important people know it's not a medical condition. It's the name of a book I wrote. But I coined the term based on a cluster of symptoms I was witnessing in so many of my female clients. So most of my clients have been women, and they would generally turn up to appointments. And if they were late, they weren't stressed, maybe a little bit, but not like later in the 2000s. And the behaviour was different, and the health patterns were different. The health pictures were different. And then around 2009 and 10, I noticed a dramatic shift in women's behaviour, in the way that they'd turn up for appointments. They were trying to jam-pack so much in before they got to an appointment. And then if they couldn't find a park, it felt like the end of the world that they couldn't find a park. And so stress, in my observation, really escalated and became more intense around that time. And because of that constant relentless stress hormone production, obviously that has a ripple effect onto reproductive system hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, thyroid function, all those things. So I know people don't turn up to have an appointment with you because they feel fantastic. They come because they're wanting to work on things and things aren't right. But I just noticed an enormous escalation in the severity of the symptoms I was seeing, and it was just the same patterns over and over again, with relentless stress in the background and a relentless, I guess, wanting to make everybody happy, a sense of responsibility on their shoulders of, I'm the caretaker of the whole world, not just my immediate family. I've got to make sure aging parents are okay. I've got to make sure my friends are okay. And there's such immense beauty in all of that caring. It's beyond belief. The world would fall apart if women stopped caring. We would lose the magnificent sense of community that caring and kindness creates. The challenge is that when we meet the needs of others constantly, it can start to take away from us taking care of ourselves. When I wrote that book, I actually got curious about women who were very community-minded. They were incredibly focused on service and contribution, but their health was fantastic. And then there was also a group of women who were very focused on service, which I came to really call servitude, because their health was suffering. And one of the big distinctions I made, and it sounds so simple now, and we do talk about it a lot now, is the ability to say no. But it's not the actual saying no, it's what's behind that. Because there were women who were of incredible service, making immense contribution to the community, to their families, in a wider scale, and yet when they had great health and energy. And one of the things that came through when I would talk to those women is they were able to still create a boundary. They still could say no when they needed to. And then there were the others who couldn't, and their health was suffering. And let's say you're drowning in tasks of your own, there's just no space in your life, and someone comes up to you and says, can you help me with this? And every bone in your body is screaming no, but what you find comes out of your mouth is, yes, sure, I'll help you. And then later you think, oh, why on earth did I agree to that? In that moment, essentially what we're worried about is what the person on the receiving end of our no is going to think of us. And I've come to call this concept forward words. A really useful exercise to do for people is to take pen and paper and ask yourself, how do I need other people to see me? And these are what I call your forward words. Like you walk around with these words on your forehead, wishing everyone could see them, sort of thing. So what are your forward words? How do I need other people to see me? Really common responses are, I need people to see me as kind, thoughtful, selfless. It might be intelligent, hilarious, entertaining, independent. Whatever it is, there's no right or wrong, but find your forward words. How do you need other people to see you? And then the next time you're stressed, pause and consider, am I perceiving someone is seeing me in the opposite way to one of my forward words? Because most of the time the answer will be yes. And for the people who can't say no, they are way more concerned about how the person who'd be on the receiving end of their no would think of them, because they might see them as opposite to one of their forward words. They might think they're unkind or thoughtless or really selfish if they don't say yes. But when you flip it around and you think, oh, if I went to someone and said, could you help me with this? And they said, oh, look, no, I'm sorry, I can't. I'd love to, but I'm drowning in my own tasks at the moment. What are you going to think of that person? Oh, well, that's it. You know, we're not friends anymore. See you later. We're not going to do that. Usually you say to someone in that situation, oh, well, I hope you're okay. Is there anything I can do to help alleviate that drowning feeling you've got? But we sort of don't afford that level of kindness to ourselves. So we say yes when we really want to say no, back to the old story of I've been talking about, because we're worried about what others think of us. So that was a big insight for me that came when I was writing Rushing Woman Syndrome, making a distinction between the caring, the kindness, the community that service and contribution make, and that is so needed in the world. However, we must be able to say no when we need to go to bed earlier, when we need a weekend where we're not doing a lot, when we need an hour to read a book, or whatever it is that nourishes your soul, that reinvigorates you, that allows you to rest. We need to be comfortable with that and all of the gifts and restoration that brings us.
So women's health issues are definitely on the rise. Why do you think we've got such an epidemic of these type of issues in the world today?
The constant and relentless output of stress hormones. I really think that's at the heart of so much. I guess I try to get to the heart of absolutely everything and not just label it as stress. And that was why I wrote The Invisible Load last year, was to really help people see what stress is for them as individuals. And so much of that comes down to caffeine. You know, when you go, what leads us to make adrenaline today? It's caffeine, it's perceptions of pressure and urgency, and it's worrying about what other people think of us. That is just about everything that leads us to make adrenaline, other than perhaps if a car drives out in front of us and we've suddenly got to slam our brakes on. Otherwise, those first three things I said, they're essentially our choice, they're in our control. So diving into what's leading us as individuals to produce those stress hormones, I think, is so critical to us improving our level of health and energy, and hormone balance obviously is a ripple effect of that.
Can I ask a huge favour? If you like this podcast, the very best thing that you can do to support us is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. This will help to push us up in the charts, which gets us into the ears of more people just like you that are also trying to make their shift. The shift! What made you so passionate about women's wellness?
Because if women's health falls apart, the entire world falls apart. So I get teary when I talk about it, because when you think about the way that we all relate to each other, the way that we speak to children, whether they're our own or children we know, the way we speak to our friends, our mothers, our sisters, our partners, our colleagues, so much of the way we communicate comes from how we feel inside of ourselves, and the way, so physiologically, and also our self-esteem, our self-worth. And I can't bear unnecessary suffering. And I have wanted women to really understand, firstly, how their body works, so that they understand steps they can take to create change in their body, in their health, so that they feel stronger, happier, better energy, better quality sleep, can look at a lighter side of things, can laugh more easily, live a fulfilled life rather than worrying about things in their body that might be bugging them. And I really care about the way that people think. We're only just beginning to understand these thought systems, but to understand that that's possible, that we can have this innate reaction and not necessarily know we've gone there, to know that we then have this other thought system that can come in and actually assess the truth of that, it can bring such a relief from the relentless stress. So I care so much because I want people to have amazing quality of lives. I want people to be able to be who they really are with confidence, not endlessly worrying about the approval of others, because we're not necessarily ourselves when we're trying to keep other people happy. And it's really, really special in those moments where you see the lights go back on for someone, when they see that they've been making up a great big story about themselves that they just created when they were a little human to try to understand the environment they were growing up in, whether it was chaotic or really calm. We all do this to ourselves because it's almost like, I think, our voids create our values. So where something might have been missing, or where we perceive something was missing in our life, we will often then value it. And often people don't value their health because there's never been a threat to their health. And I'm trying to, in my work, for it not to take a health crisis to wake people up to make the changes that they know in their hearts they need to make today to prevent the health crisis from happening. Because we know in our hearts when we need to do things differently. We know when we need to make some different food choices. We know when we need to start going to bed earlier. We know when we need to make a change in a particular relationship, exercise more, whatever it is. We know in our hearts how to take care of ourselves, and I'm trying to remove the blocks that might be there because of beliefs that people have absorbed as little kids about their worth, trying to remove those beliefs so that they can act on what they know.
That is so beautiful. I can tell from your passion that, you walk the talk, you're on the journey, you're learning and discovering about yourself as much as everyone else. And what I would really love to know is, what's been the biggest shift that you've made in your life, and what did you discover about yourself as a result of that?
So in my early 20s, some things changed with my health. And so I'd come out of very conventional nutrition training, which I'm very grateful for because I learnt incredibly robust science, but I was taught that the food pyramid was the way that everybody needed to eat. And I would follow that to the letter, being a bit of a goody two-shoes that I am. I would follow that to the letter. And so then in my very early 20s, when I faced some health challenges, I thought, well, it can't be my food because, I eat exactly the way I've been taught to eat. And after seeing a gastroenterologist and him saying, well, I can't see that there's anything wrong, it must all be in your head, when I won't go into detail about the symptoms I was experiencing, but it certainly wasn't in my head and they were incredibly debilitating. Something in me woke up and went, well, I have to solve this myself because he can't tell me what's going on and I'm doing everything that I was taught to do as far as food goes, but something's not right because my body is not happy given the symptoms that it's presenting me with. And so I set about, in a way, being my own detective, and I made significant changes to what I was eating back then, and it set me on the path really that I am still on today. I don't think I would be the health educator that I am today if I hadn't experienced that. And obviously with health challenges of your own, it's initially incredibly confronting. It can be very frightening, and you can feel very alone, especially when the experts, in inverted commas, can't offer you any assistance. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me because I had to solve it myself, and I did. I resolved it completely within 12 months, and it showed me the incredible power of the body to heal when you give it what it needs. It really helped me to trust myself. It taught me that there is no one way for all people to eat. It taught me that just because someone is an expert, they don't necessarily know what's right for me or another person. We need experts, of course. If you need legal advice, you go to a lawyer. Of course, we need experts for things. But I am a big fan of helping people to get back in touch with what they know in their hearts is true for them. So that experience, that challenge with my health in my early 20s really changed the course of my life because of what I learned, but it shifted the way that I think, and it made me very curious. I had to learn a whole new approach to food, and I'm very grateful for that. It changed everything.
So one of the conversations we're having on this series is just the way that women have been discounted when it comes to things like period pain and other things that they experience. Why do you think that we're so disconnected from our body's wisdom?
We have been taught not to trust it. So I think from a really early age, the first thing we're taught not to trust is our appetite. And a lot of women are frightened of their appetite and their hunger. So then as things develop and periods start, and probably if it all gets handed down from generation to generation, so if grandma and mum both had really challenging periods, you're told, well, it's just how it is, or maybe you just talk about it amongst your friends and everybody else has period pain, so you just think that it's just normal. But I will often say it's common, but it's not normal. And our periods obviously are an incredible barometer. They're incredible feedback to us about our choices, about how we're living. And I will often say that our body gives us symptoms to let us know when it needs us to make some changes, either with the way that we eat, drink, move, think, breathe, believe, or perceive. Or sometimes it's a number of those areas. And it's, I guess, finding something inside yourself, finding the courage inside yourself to think, I've got to take charge of this because this is not right. I don't want to live like this. So there's insight and learning in this for me. So I want to step forward in another way. But I think the first distrust that I think kicks in for a lot of women is the distrust of their appetite, and they feel like they have to suppress it or dodge it, or that it can become so out of control so easily, and they're often frightened of it.
One last question for you. If you could give just one piece of advice for someone that wants to make a shift in their health or their life, what would it be?
One of the ways to bring more calm, I think, which obviously fosters extraordinary levels of health, is let yourself have what you already have. Because when you talk to people who are dying and you ask them what they're going to miss the most, they will tell you the most ordinary things. So they will say, I'm going to miss my partner's face. I'm going to miss the night sky. I'm going to miss patting my dog. I'm going to miss the smell of freshly picked parsley, whatever it is. And we have all of that right now. So let yourself have what you already have, because that's what joy is all about. And joy gives us endless levels of energy. It gives us endless energy. And that when we have great energy, we can do anything. And we have more confidence to be who we really are. When we have better energy, it allows us to make more home-cooked meals. It allows us to do some exercise. I think our patience is better when we have better energy. But I think so much energy can come from joy, and I think a lot of joy can come from letting ourselves have what we already have.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me on The Shift, Dr. Libby Weaver. It's just been a fantastic conversation.
I'm so grateful, Katherine. Thank you so much for having me and for the great work you're doing.
Dr. Libby is such a powerhouse when it comes to women's health. What a great interview. Let's review some of the key points and what you can take action on as a result of them. First of all, we need to look at the landscape of our entire health. We need to consider the synergism between all the different processes of the body, but also how our emotional landscape impacts this too. I love that Dr. Libby has never weighed a single patient. Body fat reduction is a natural consequence of your body becoming more healthy. When we focus on correcting the underlying issues, weight loss will follow. For more on this, go back to Season 2, Episode 11, Why Can't I Lose Weight? Most of the stress we experience day to day is internal stress that is created from our minds. This is mostly due to the expectations that we put on ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves about how others perceive us. Therefore, we need to focus on our internal dialogue and belief systems in order to shift stress. Lastly, I loved how Dr. Libby said that if a woman's health falls apart, her world falls apart. This really rings true for a lot of people. Learning is great, but action is better. Here are some things that you could do as a result of listening to this conversation to help you shift your health and your life. Be kind to yourself. Notice your internal dialogue and be conscious about the way you talk to yourself every day. Is your internal dialogue helping you or harming you? Stop weighing yourself and setting a number of pounds or kilograms as a health goal. This will set you up for failure every time you don't move towards where you think you need to be. Instead, why not focus on your overall health? What would a thriving version of yourself do? What habits do you need to install in your life? Instead, focus on mastering your healthy habits as a health goal, and the rest will follow. Dr. Libby's final piece of advice was to let yourself have what you already have. She mentioned that when people die, it is the most ordinary of things they say they will miss, the daily things that you already have available to you right now. So focus on what gives you joy, what already makes you smile, and be grateful for that each and every day. Thank you so much, Dr. Libby, for sharing your wisdom with us on The Shift. If you like this episode, please let us know by sharing on social media and tagging Dr. Libby and myself, Katherine Maslin, or The Shift Clinic so that we can hear what you have to say. You can find out more about Dr. Libby Weaver on her socials or website Dr. Libby, where you'll find heaps of amazing books, resources, and courses for you to dive into. In the next episode of the Shift Expert series, we have Dr. Suzanne Bartlett Hacken-Miller. Dr. Suzanne is an integrative obstetrician and gynecologist and also a certified forest therapist. The tips in this next episode are so relevant and practical, so make sure that you tune in.
Coming up on The Shift.
They found that all of these parameters of both physical and mental health improved over this time spent forest bathing in nature. And really, it's only been the last couple of 100 years that we've become such indoor creatures. I absolutely do believe that we're healthier when we're outdoors, coming into contact with the soil and plants and not trying to be so hygienic all of the time.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslin. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice
and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
The global goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the global goals.
This project supports global goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most.